It's a great pleasure for me to be here with Ambassador Dermer and Ambassador Hook, actually. Ambassador Dermer, by the way, is, I'm not going to give long introductions. He's one of us, Miami, born and bred. Oxford schooled, Wharton schooled, and obviously the Israeli ambassador to the United States of America. One of the things that's really most important about Ambassador Dermer is that, and this is really unique, by the way, among ambassadors, he spoke for the Prime Minister. When you were talking to Ron Dermer, you were talking to Bibi Netanyahu. And that makes a big difference. And that's really, it was a gift for us. You know, nothing ever got lost in translation. And Brian Hook has served this country well. I'm laughing because we actually went to the same law school, so we kind of got connections here. And he went to the same college my son went to. But aside from the personal, he has been served in the Bush White House, served in the Justice Department. Most recently in the Reagan administration, he was special senior counsel to Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, and then he was also the Iran envoy. He was a special representative. This is the guy who kind of worked on Iran. And Brian, I got to tell you, it must break your heart to see that we have now Rob Malley as the Iran envoy, kind of filling your shoes. And for those who don't know, I think Tom Cotton said it well. Malley has a long history of sympathy for the Iranians and animus to Israel, and it's a shame that he's sitting in that position. But I'm just going to turn. I want to talk about the Iran deal first, a little bit, and then we're going to kind of move on to some other things. But let's talk about the Iran deal. The Dems are intent. They were thrilled to bring it to the table. By the way, without any conditions on stopping Iranian terrorism, without any conditions on missile development, and they want to bring it back. Help me understand, if we can, kind of what you think they're thinking and why it's so insane.
Thank you, Senator. Good to be with everybody here, and also with my great friend, Ambassador Dermer. Look, when we were in office, we inherited the Iran nuclear deal, which I think many of our partners in the region who then later made peace with Israel, Bahrain, and UAE, thought this was a betrayal. And when American foreign policy doesn't stand with our friends and deters our adversaries, a lot of bad things happen. And so we reversed that policy. We decided to stand with Israel, stand with our Gulf partners, deter and counter Iran. And it was very hard to do that inside the Iran deal because you can't touch the oil. Oil is the lifeblood of the Iranian regime. And under the Iran nuclear deal, you can't sanction their oil. You can't sanction their petrochem. You can't sanction metals. I mean, John Kerry was essentially acting as the president of the Tehran Chamber of Commerce. That's what the deal does to you. It makes you a champion of the Iranian economy, which is the banker for Hezbollah, Hamas, PIJ, and all sorts of terrorist activity around the world. So President Trump, I think, understood uniquely that in order for us to have leverage over this regime, we have to get out of the deal. We got out of the deal, and then we were able to take, Iran is 3% of the world's oil supply. That's $50 billion a year in revenue, the oil. When we came into office, they were at 2.7 million barrels of oil a day, and we took them down to 70,000 barrels. And when you do that, the downstream consequences are magnificent because it causes Hassan Nasrallah to have to do fundraising drives because his banker is out of money. And it puts Hamas on an austerity budget. So I think the deal also has already started to expire. When we were in office, the UN arms embargo expired. The deal's going to keep expiring. There really is no deal left to join. So I'm a little baffled by the whole theory of the case. And I'll close on, at least on this part of Iran. There's only a successful Iran policy needs just a couple of components. You have to have maximum economic pressure, the credible threat of military force to defend our interests, diplomatic isolation, and standing with the Iranian people, who really do hate this regime. And so those were the four pieces. And if you have that in place, you can really, I think, achieve some pretty significant results.
So, Ambassador Dermer, President Trump took a lot of grief for canceling and pulling us out of the Iran deal. In fact, I had a conversation at breakfast one time with General Mattis, Secretary of Defense, who was telling me what a disaster it would be for Israel if we pulled out of the JCPOA. Talk to us about the regional context of what that deal originally how it impacted Israel, the region. Talk about pulling out, and talk about where we should go next.
So first thing is, can you hear me in the back of the room? Not great. Not great now. Can you hear me in the back of the room? Yeah? I'm going to try to project. So first thing, before I answer your question about Iran, I want to say something about my colleague, Brian. Now, Brian was the special envoy dealing with Iran, and he also was intimately involved in the Abraham Accords. He's the only person in the administration who was dealing with both issues, who I dealt with on a day-to-day basis on both issues. Brian Hook today has a security detail on him. Now, former presidents have a security detail, former vice presidents have a security detail, occasionally a former Secretary of State has a security detail. It is, I think, unprecedented that a special envoy, after the end of an administration, has a security detail on him. And the reason he has a security detail on him is that day after day in his job, he confronted the enemies of America and the enemies of Israel. And I think we should all show him a deep debt of gratitude. Now, I want to remind people why the Iran deal was so dangerous, and why it remains dangerous today, and why the decision of President Trump, in my view, Senator Cruz said it yesterday, I agree with him, it was the most important foreign policy decision that President Trump made to pull out of that Iran deal. The Iran deal does not block Iran's path to a bomb. That's what was said in 2015. It was a lie then, and it's a lie today. It paves Iran's path to a bomb because the restrictions it puts in place are automatically removed in about 10 to 15 years. And in those two words, automatically removed, you understand why Israel was opposed to this deal. Because 10 or 15 years, as Prime Minister Netanyahu said in his speech to Congress, that's a long time in the life of politics, but it's a blink of an eye in the life of a nation. We are over 6 years beyond the nuclear deal, and everybody's talking about going back. What would going back do? Well, right now they say, well, Iran is closer to getting a nuclear bomb, right? Because it's 3 months away from having the fissile material. So let's go back into the deal and let's move a few months back. All you do is take 2 steps back so that in a few years, Iran will have no breakout time to a bomb. In year 12, the breakout time of the nuclear deal, that's 2027, year 12. 2027, the breakout time, which is defined as acquiring the fissile material necessary for a bomb, the breakout time is close to 0. And those are not my words, those are the words of former President Obama in a moment of candor on NPR radio, where he said, in year 12, the breakout time will be close to 0. We cannot accept a deal that would be a glide path for Iran, which vows to destroy the state of Israel and works every day to destroy the state of Israel and leaves chance of death to America and death to Israel. We cannot allow them a glide path to nuclear weapons. That's why it has to be opposed. Now, in addition to that, not only did it not solve the nuclear problem, it created a much worse regional problem because it fueled Iran's campaign of conquest and carnage throughout the Middle East by allowing them, as Brian said, to sell oil on the financial markets. That's the big money of the deal. The big money was not that signing bonus, and people argued, is it 50 billion? Is it 100 billion? What Brian said is right. Every single month, Iran was getting another $4 to $5 billion, and it wasn't using that money to establish a GI Bill for returning members of the Revolutionary Guard. It was doing this to fuel that aggression in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Yemen, in Gaza. And that's why the decision was so important. But just remember the timeline. President Trump refused to recertify the deal October 2017. Took about 10 months. Then it was another 8 months or so before he decided to withdraw from the deal, which is May 18. But there were still waivers on the sale of oil at that time, and it was allowing Iran to sell 1 million barrels a day. It was only in May 2019, when those waivers were removed, that you actually had maximum pressure on Iran. And as Brian said, within a few months, you took them from 3 million barrels a day to a couple 100,000 barrels a day. It's a huge shift, and it was drying up their resources. So Iran only faced maximum pressure for a year and a half, but they had a lifeline. And the lifeline was that every single person who was running for president on the other side of the aisle was telling them, we are going to go back into this deal. Instead of actually standing with that decision and showing to the Iranians that no matter who you're going to elect here in the United States, we're going to continue this maximum pressure policy, they did the opposite. And they said, basically, help is on the way. And now we find ourselves in a situation where the Iranians are not even willing to go back into the deal because, you know what, they think they're going to get an even better deal from this administration. And it's a very dangerous situation. The United States should do exactly what Brian said. You need a credible military threat. Without that, diplomacy will not work. You need to keep maximum economic pressure. And the third element, which Brian also mentioned, is you have to reach out to the people of Iran. They are not your enemy. They are not Israel's enemy. They are the enemy of that regime. They have virtually no support from the outside world. And I hope that in Congress and other American leaders and other leaders around the world will reach out directly to the Iranian people, because they're our hope if we're going to avoid a potential military confrontation. We might have to move in that direction. There might be no choice. And I hope that whoever is sitting in the Prime Minister's chair in Israel will make the decision that they have to make in order to secure the Jewish future.
Thank you. But by the way, I do have to... I would like to acknowledge the presence of the great one, Mark Levin. He's going to speak to us tonight, but it's always great to have Mark. One more question on Iran as a segue to the Abraham Accords. In many ways, could one argue that by doing the original JCPOA, in which they didn't tell the Israelis negotiating with Iran, didn't tell the Saudis that they were negotiating with Iran, told the Saudis, Obama, that you've got to learn to live with Iran in the neighborhood. It's like telling a family of 6 kids they got to learn to live with a pedophile who's living next door to them. Talk to me about Iran's malign activities, and talk to me about how that kind of fits in to then coming together and ultimately achieving one of the greatest achievements of our time, which really is the Abraham Accords. Ambassador Dermer, I'll turn to you first.
So we could see in Israel that there was a shift in the Arab world. It wasn't there 20 years ago. I don't think it was even there 10 years ago. About 7 or 8 years ago, you could see that many leaders in the Arab world had recognized that their interests would be served by moving into an open alliance with Israel. And why did they recognize it? One was they were afraid of Iran and the rising power of Iran. The second, they were afraid of ISIS, which is Sunni radicalism. Iran is a Shia radical power, but you have Sunni radicalism. Al-Qaeda was 1.0, ISIS is 2.0, and there'll be a 3.0. The other thing they realized, which is not understood as much as it should be, is they understood that you, the United States, you are not looking to get involved in wars in the Middle East, to send troops to the Middle East. You want to reduce your military footprint in the Middle East, if not leave entirely. So from the point of view of these Arab countries, what they see is an Iranian tiger, they see an ISIS leopard, whoever's going to come next, and you, the 800-pound American gorilla, is leaving the building. So they look around and they see a 200-pound gorilla with a kippah on, and they say, you know, maybe we'll work with them. And that made them want to actually make this alliance with us. In addition, they also recognize the power of Israeli technology. Understand that the traditional Arab boycott of Israel is about as clever as Oregon, Nevada, Utah, Wyoming, Arizona, New Mexico, and half of California boycotting Silicon Valley. It makes no sense because we are a global technological power in many areas, and many areas critical for the future: cyber, artificial intelligence, autonomous vehicles. So they're seeing the situation, and they want to actually surface this relationship. But they have a problem. They've been poisoning their population for 70 years against Israel, against Jews, against America in some cases. And something had to change in U.S. policy to bring this to the surface. And here's where the Trump administration comes in. What we needed from a U.S. administration, and we tried, and Brian can speak to this, we tried out of the gate to get the Trump administration to realize what the opportunity was in the region. And at first it was hard going, but then they got it. And then when they went around the region, and Brian and Jared and others, and they listened to Arab leaders, they know that what Israel was telling them was the truth. But we needed an administration, one, that would confront Iran, because that opens the space for the Arab leaders to move into an alliance with us. The second, embrace Israel. The peace happened after the decision of Jerusalem, after the decision of the Golan Heights, after the decision on Judea and Samaria. That's not a coincidence, because it convinced the Arabs that the way to strengthen your relationship with Washington was to move closer to Jerusalem. And the third aspect was to remove the Palestinian veto over this whole process. For 2 decades, people were telling me on both sides of the aisle, you know, if you make peace with the Palestinians, you'll have peace with the 21, 22 Arab states. Well, that's great. What if the Palestinians don't want to make peace with Israel? What, are they going to wait? And eventually the Arabs were willing to move without the Palestinians because the United States did not chase after the Palestinians. They opened the door. If a Palestinian leadership wants to walk through and move into a peace with Israel, that's fine, but we're not going to chase after them. And I think the decisions they made and the policies they took opened that space. And people have to understand how unique this is. In 72 years, we had 2 peace agreements. And in 4 months, we had 4. And people ask, who's next? And understand, it's not just going to happen on its own. It's not manna from heaven. You have to have an administration that will confront Iran, that will embrace Israel, and that will not give the Palestinians a veto. Appeasing Iran, which is what's happening now, is not going to give you another actor in the Abraham Accords. It's not going to increase the number of elements. Embrace Israel, and the third element of making sure the Palestinians don't have a veto, one of the problems of potentially putting a consulate in Jerusalem, not only is it illegal and not only divides Jerusalem, it undermines the prospects for peace, because it's beginning to restore the Palestinian veto. There is no reason to do it, and I was very glad to see that 200 members of Congress from the Republican Party oppose this. I hope there will be Democratic voices that will come out against doing this. It's wrong, it shouldn't happen. It's bad for the U.S.-Israel relationship, and it's bad for the pursuit of peace.
Brian, I'm going to ask you to weigh in, but thank you. I'm going to ask you to weigh in on the Iran deal, but I also want you to weigh in on the moving the consulate issue. I think that's important, and I'd love to get your perspective.
So a couple of points there. I agree with everything that the ambassador said. Our Iran policy, as Ron said, created some space for a lot of our Arab friends to come inside to counter a common enemy. And when we're all in the same room together, organizing against a common threat, it opens other diplomatic doors. And so when we organized the Global Ministerial on Peace in the Middle East in Warsaw, Poland, for the first time since the 1991 Madrid conference, and the ambassador and I helped organize this Warsaw Ministerial, we had 70 countries there. At the presidential palace, you had all the Gulf foreign ministers and then other Arab foreign ministers in the same room with the Israeli prime minister. It had to happen since 1991. And what did they all talk about? Iran. And Bibi even joked. He said, after he heard all of the Gulf foreign ministers talk, he said, I've been dethroned. I thought I was the hawk. But this was the pent-up sort of frustration with the prior foreign policy of essentially reaching an accommodation with the Iranian regime, which is not interested in an accommodation. They want dominance. They want regional hegemony. And they want to destroy Israel. That's the whole purpose of the Quds Force. So we were able to bring the Arabs and the Israelis together against a common enemy, which I think was a necessary but insufficient condition. You needed other things to happen. President Trump moving the embassy really was a profoundly important moment for the region, because nothing happened. And I was in the room when these decisions were made, and there were a lot of warnings to the president that this was very dangerous. And the president acted on principle, and a lot of those warnings turned out to be, they weren't fulfilled. A lot of these concerns weren't fulfilled. Then he recognizes Golan. Nothing happened. And so what does this say to Gulf leaders like MBZ and the King of Bahrain and others? This is a new Middle East. And if you're under 40 in the Middle East, you've moved on. You're not haunted by the ghosts of your parents and your grandparents on this. You want a better life. You want to normalize with Israel for all the reasons that the ambassador talked about on the technology side. So When Jared and I and ran around the region, exactly what he said. We listened. Jared did not. He came into office on the Middle East peace process. He did not have the baggage of expertise. You got a lot of people who've written a lot of books and they've worked it out in their head. But Jared went and listened. He listened and he put in the time. I mean, diplomacy is about time. And he dedicated the time to it. And I have nothing but admiration for his commitment to that mission set. So after I got, I was running policy planning at State, and then I became the Iran envoy, and I've been working with Jared on the peace process from the beginning. But then when I became the Iran envoy, I said, our files are about to become mutually reinforcing. And so it was a really nice sort of joining of these two files. And so, Jared really put in the time and the relationship building, and he had the backing of the president and the backing of Secretary Pompeo. We also, one other thing I'll mention here, in Washington personnel is policy. I think it was providential that we had the people in place that we did. So you had Jared with the president. You had Ambassador Dermer with the Prime Minister. You had Yusuf Al-Otaiba with MBZ. You had the Bahrain ambassador, Sheikh Abdullah, with the Crown Prince and the King in Bahrain. We were able to get things done really at light speed, 4 agreements in 5 months after a 26-year drought. Why has that momentum disappeared? I mean, we had the wind at our back. And we were on a really nice run. 2 peace agreements in Africa, 2 in the Middle East. There were more to come. We were working on those. There ought to be more, and there will be more.
I don't want to bring us down on that positive note, but, if past this prologue, we talk about what the past administration, this is now the policy. This is where this administration is going. This is actually an American political question, so I'll turn to you, to Brian. What is it we see Congressman Walz here, he's going to speak with us later. Knowing, if past this prologue, if we have in place makes a difference, and the Rob Malley's and the Susan Rice's and the Samantha Powell's and all these others back in place, what is it that the American people, what can the American Congress do to slow up this path that this administration is on for appeasement with Iran? To move back into whatever is left of the JCPOA. What is it that can be done to slow that up until Republicans take back power in Congress?
I think in some ways it is slowed up pretty dramatically because I think they're out of cards. I think they've played a lot of their cards, and it hasn't achieved their desired outcome. And so I don't know what the plan B is because everything was kind of mortgaged on the Iran deal and Iran coming to the table. But I think the Iranians learned to hang back and just keep letting the unilateral concessions come their way. And now the Iranian regime is enjoying a lot of the benefits of being out of the deal without the restrictions of being in it, with oil exports being where they are now. We enforce not only did we put the sanctions in place, we reinforced them with a lot of zeal. And you've got to have a really tight sanctions regime in place to show that you mean it, and that you really are determined to deny the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism the revenue it needs to execute, its agenda. And so I would just say, Congress plays a role in this with thought leaders reminding the American people that we need to be no better friend and no worst enemy. That's the role of the United States, especially in a place like the Middle East. We need to be bringing our friends closer and closer together to work on all of the common interests we have diplomatically, economically, culturally, socially, all of these great things. But then we also need to be standing up to the people who have a very dark vision for the world and for Israel and the United States. That's a winning formula. I don't think foreign policy in the Middle East is all that complicated. President Trump, I think, kind of cracked the code in the Middle East. And it's been a long couple of decades on American foreign policy in the Middle East of, I would say, overextension and retrenchment. But I think that President Trump got the balance right in the Middle East. While we were in office, we were able to get a lot done. Just that playbook works. and I would say stick with that playbook of standing with Israel, working with our Gulf partners, and a lot of good things happen when you have that in place.
So, Ambassador Dermer, Iran recently had a quote an election, and the butcher of Tehran gets elected president, right? Ibrahim Raisi. So is Rouhani really a moderate, and is this guy any different? And what does that mean? Talk to me about kind of the atmosphere in the region now, with a different administration in Washington, with Iran just perhaps being more upfront, with their malign activities and their malign ways. Give me kind of walk me through the region and tell me how all this is playing out.
Well, Iran's leadership has moved from a wolf in sheep's clothing to a wolf in wolf's clothing.
Yeah.
But the president of Iran doesn't control Iran. You don't get called the supreme leader for nothing, right? The supreme leader of Iran, he's the one that calls the shots. And we should all be concerned about the current policy, because you got to ask yourself, why is Iran not going back into this deal that is such a great deal for them and such a bad deal for the United States, such a big debt? Why are they not going back into the deal? So to me, it can be one of two reasons. Either because they think they're going to squeeze out more concessions from this administration. The longer they wait, the more they advance and they do research and they get expertise in their program. So maybe they think they'll draw that out for a few weeks. That could be the case. And then they'll go back into a deal, take a step back, so that in 5 or 6 years from now, they can break out to a bomb. Or they decided, guess what? There's no credible threat against us in Washington. And maybe they think there's no credible threat against them in Jerusalem, and that they're going to break out to a bomb now. So the most important thing that has to happen, you asked him a question about Washington. It's not a political issue for me. This is a matter of the survival of the state of Israel. The most important thing that elected leaders in the United States can do is make clear that they are prepared to use any means to prevent Iran from developing nuclear weapons, period. And if that means an authorization of military force to give the president that power, do it. And if it could be in 2022, it could be in 2021, whenever it is, show that your party is behind it, because the danger here is that appeasement's going to have grave, grave consequences. What happened in the 1930s with appeasement, the reason why it happened, people don't ask themselves that question. What, were they all fools? Were they all immoral? No. You had World War I, 16 million people were killed, and perhaps the dumbest war in human history. And leaders were elected to avoid conflict at all costs. And it's not that they didn't see or hear what was coming out of Berlin. They didn't want to see, and they didn't want to hear. And you have a moment now where after Iraq and Afghanistan, without getting into the politics of those conflicts, people say, we don't want to get involved in the Middle East. And the danger is you have an Iranian regime who sees that and can rush towards nuclear weapons. And it will change our world. Because a militant Islamic power armed with nuclear weapons is a hinge of history. It's different than the Soviet Union having nuclear weapons. You didn't have hordes of communist suicide bombers. This is a fanatic regime. And the most important foreign policy issue, in addition to America's battle with China over who's going to be the leading superpower in the 21st century, and believe me, Israel wants America to be that power and to continue to be that power, the most important foreign policy issue is to prevent a militant Islamic regime from developing nuclear weapons. Everything else pales in comparison, and all the politics are meaningless, because if that happens, the world shifts. And everybody, I don't care if you're Republican or Democrat, it doesn't make a difference. We have to do what we have to do to prevent that from happening. And what happened in Afghanistan, the message that sends throughout the region by the withdrawal, again, without getting into the politics, the withdrawal it sends is weakness. It projects weakness. And when America is perceived to be weak, that harms Israel's deterrence, because our enemies are emboldened. And that's the situation you have today, and that has to be changed very, very quickly to keep Israel safe, to keep America safe, and to keep your other allies in the region safe.
I would note that the RJC board had a mission to celebrate the Abraham Accords last June. And we were in Jerusalem. We got a chance to speak with the Prime Minister. We were in Abu Dhabi, and then we were in Riyadh. And I will tell you that when we met with the Crown Prince in Abu Dhabi, Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed, who really is one of the visionary leaders in the region, his first comment to us, here we have 25 members of the RJC board, and his first, as he spoke, the first thing he said is why are you leaving Afghanistan? Don't you understand what's going to happen to in Afghanistan, in this region, if you pull out? And either way, that was a month, 2 months before the disaster. And so obviously in the region, folks understand. Ambassador, I'd like to give you voice of rest, but I can't because I want to follow up that question about Washington. And I want to just turn to Israel. You've had an elections. I've longer than the 9-month recount that stole my election. Your elections are longer than that. You have a new government in Israel with a paper-thin majority. How does the region, how do the malign actors, how do folks kind of look at that, and how does the fragility of that coalition affect Israel's ability to do what it needs to do to ensure that Jews are safe, Israel is safe, and the world is safe?
Well, look, I wish my new government well in Israel. I don't want to get into a political debate being outside the country. They used to have this concept that the politics stops at the water's edge, so I try to abide by that in my country. And I hope that Prime Minister Bennett will have the same position when it comes to Iran as Prime Minister Netanyahu. What I can tell you is that Prime Minister Netanyahu was sitting in that chair in Jerusalem. People believed that he was prepared to act. And because he was prepared to act, we had the 12 safest years in Israel's history. The best security period in Israel's history was the 12 years when Prime Minister Netanyahu sat in that chair, and I was privileged to serve both in Jerusalem and as ambassador in Washington. And I hope that a new administration, the new government that we have, with all of its difficulties, and it's a hodgepodge of parties, it's about 8 different parties, and there's right, and there's left, and there's center, there are all sorts of parties there. I hope on the most important security and diplomatic issues facing the country, they take a very, very tough line, which makes it clear that, one, we speak with the united voice that we are going to do whatever we have to do to prevent Iran from developing nuclear weapons. That's number one. Number two is to say no to the opening of a Palestinian consulate in Jerusalem. I would say to the left-wing parties in my country, you will undermine peace if you do that. And the good news for us is, unlike many other decisions that don't depend on Israel, this one does. If Israel government says no, it will not happen. So I hope that they're going to say no. And to continue to take the action regionally, and according to foreign press reports, Israel is continuing to take that action in other theaters in the region, to continue to confront Iran day in and day out, and to let them know, the Iranian regime, we're not going to give an inch. That policy must continue because it's critical for our security, and I think it's critical for American security right now. And one thing, Brian said, and you mentioned also, the fear that you have of these other parties in the region about what is happening. And that actually, in a strange way, will move them closer to Israel, but it will be underneath the surface. The only way we're going to be able to surface this and to expand on the Abraham Accords, and I'm telling you, if this policy, confront Iran, embrace Israel, don't give the Palestinians a veto, if that continues, you will have peace between Israel and Saudi Arabia within a year, maybe within 6 months. That can happen under this administration, but they have to do a 180-degree turn on Iran. They have to embrace Israel more than ever, and they cannot open that consulate. They can give the Palestinians a path if they choose to live in peace with us, but don't chase after them. If they continue those policies, they will succeed, and we can end the Israeli-Arab conflict. We will still have a conflict with the Palestinians. We will still have a conflict with Iran. But one of the things that was difficult in those last few months of the Trump administration, we knew, I knew, Brian knew, Jared knew, other people knew, we were nearing an endgame for the Israeli-Arab conflict. And what has prevented us from moving ahead has been the wrong policy, particularly with regard to Iran. If that changes, we can move back on the right path for peace and the right path for security.
And Ambassador Hook, I want to follow up in the 5 minutes. And by the way, I want to end on an optimistic. I want to talk about Abraham Accords and kind of what's next. With all the challenges, again, what was accomplished really was incredible and kind of set the stage for better things. But there are challenges. And this administration doesn't even want to use the phrase Abraham Accords. And so you can't speak it. How do you act on it? How do you do it? You know the players in the administration. Talk to me about your sense of what was poised to come next, whether it's still possible to come next, and can it be possible even with this administration in the next couple of years, or do we have to wait for a Republican president in 2024?
I remember when we were in the Oval Office and we had announced, that there was peace now between Israel and UAE, and I remember saying to the press at the time that history will remember this as the beginning of the end of the Arab-Israeli conflict. That's the opportunity. I mean, the region, so much of the region is ready. So much of the region is ready. I mean, even if you look at a country like Iran, 2/3 of the country was born after the revolution. The Islamic Republic is neither in so many ways. And that extends across other, when you get outside of Iran, you get to the Arab world, and there is still this real desire to have better lives. It's a lot of the basic things that I think so many of the younger people, and certainly the Gulf understands this uniquely. You look at the leadership in the Gulf and how much sort of the pace of change there is extraordinary. You had Pope Francis come to the Gulf during the year that MBZ had the year of tolerance and the combating extremism, which was a big part of President Trump's agenda. When we flew to Saudi Arabia for the 57 Arab Muslim nations that come together, and President Trump, I thought it was one of his best speeches during his 4 years in office. He said, you have an extremism problem, but it's not something that we can't solve that. You have to solve it. But if you want to solve it, you'll have no better partner than the United States. And that resonated. I remember, talking with a lot of Arab leaders after the speech, and they said, finally a guy who really is speaking the truth about the challenges, the internal challenges we have, whether it's Sunni or Shia extremism. And you have a lot of leaders now who want to turn the page. And you need to bring them close. You've got to bring them in close to you and not treat them like pariahs. So I think that's important to do. There's just a lot of good opportunities out there if there is the will. I'm not sure the will is there, but it's there.
Ambassador Dermer, I'm going to ask you to end us on a high note. There's a lot that's going on in the region, flights from India flying over the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Talk to us about even those who had peace with Israel, Jordan, and Egypt, and kind of what's happening, kind of recharging, reinvigorating that. And end us on a positive note for kind of what holds forth in the future for Israel and for the Middle East.
Look, it's definitely a sea change in the region, the Abraham Accords. It's very different than our peace with Egypt or our peace with Jordan, which was a cold peace, largely because of them, not because of us. We would have loved to have a warm peace, a peace between peoples. It was a cold peace, which is certainly better than a hot war, but it never developed in the way that I think peace between two countries should develop. And you look at the difference that happened last year with the peace with the Emirates, followed by the other countries who we made peace with, and the Emirates in particular, because it is such a critical country in the whole region. And you see that this is a peace that's not just coming from the top down, it's coming from the bottom up. Just as a show of hands, how many people have been to the Emirates? Wow, pretty significant group. And when the peace happened, I said, don't be surprised that in a year from now, when you travel to Dubai, you're going to hear more Hebrew in the hotel rooms than Arabic. And when you go to Tel Aviv, you're going to hear more Arabic than you're going to hear Hebrew. This thing is really taking off, and it presents a huge opportunity for Israel, because when you combine what the resources that the Emiratis have, the entrepreneurship that they have, the capacity for innovation that they have with our capacity for innovation, the sky's the limit. You get the most bang for your buck of any, or buck for your bang, I should say, for any country in the region. And we're seeing that this peace, you heard that from Yusuf Al-Otaiba yesterday, it also has started to affect the peace that we have with Egypt and Jordan, because some of them say, why don't we have a peace like the peace that Israel has with the Emiratis? So I think here, the sky is the limit to what we can achieve. A lot of it has been kind of repressed because of COVID. We haven't seen the full impact of this. I think you're going to see that in the next 2 or 3 years. But the important thing to continue this is that the strategic window is wide open. Yeah. The Arab states want to be in an alliance with Israel. That's the critical question. Do they want to be in an alliance with Israel? And the answer is yes today, just as it was yes in 2018, or it was even in 2013. It was no in 2002. It was no in 2008. It was probably no in 2012. But today it's yes, and I see that window staying open. What you need in order to drive that through is that you need U.S. policy to put in place the right policies across the board on Iran, on Israel, on the Palestinians that gives them the space to move through. And the final thing I'll say, every president wants to win a Nobel Prize, right? President Trump deserved it. Because of the Abraham Accords, and it was so critical, his confrontational posture versus Iran that made those Abraham Accords possible. He deserved it, he didn't get it. Doesn't matter. President Biden can win the Nobel Prize because they'll give it to him. He can do it, I'm telling you, in 6 months. But he needs to stop appeasing Iran. He needs to confront that regime. Go to the Saudis and say, we got to work with you. We know we have issues. We will resolve those issues. We want you to stand publicly with Israel, and I'm going to back you. If that happens, you will see peace between, you're laughing, but if that happens, you will see peace between Israel and Saudi Arabia. And if he does not do it, and I hope he does, then I hope the next president will do it, because that window is going to stay open, I think, for a decade, maybe more. And we need to do everything we can to end the Arab-Israeli conflict. It's within our grasp, and let's make sure we make it happen.
Absolutely. And I would add, just to put an exclamation point at the end of what Ron said, I was on the first flight from Tel Aviv to Abu Dhabi, we flew over Saudi airspace. I was on an El Al plane flying over Saudi, and they had the map, you're flying over Saudi Arabia on an El Al flight, commercial flight. It was one of the greatest days of my life. And now then, you've got flights now, a lot of flights, Dubai and Abu Dhabi and Tel Aviv, Morocco, Bahrain. Every single one of these people is now an ambassador of the Abraham Accords. And as that keeps going, all of these flights, that's the cultural thing, like what Ron was saying about they're all Arabic and Hebrew and all their different places. That's going to keep going, and that's why I'm very optimistic about the Middle East. I've never been more optimistic about the Middle East for all the reasons that Ron was describing. I really do believe it's only going to get better. We can feed the good fire and extinguish the bad as the United States on the foreign policy. If we have that in place, those things are going to keep going. But regardless, I think it's all very positive.
Let us give a big round of applause to incredible public servants and to dear, dear friends of the RJC. Thank you.